The saddlebag hit the table with a sound like a gunshot, and every head in the outpost turned. "You!" Marshal Cord Hennessy's finger stabbed through the dusty air of the trading post like an accusation. "You are going to tell me what you found, Miss Alden, and you are going to tell me right now, or so help me I will have you locked up for interfering with a federal investigation." Abigail Alden did not flinch. She stood at the center of Fort Laramie's cramped supply outpost with her spine straight as a lodgepole pine, and her dark eyes fixed on the marshal with an expression that communicated, with perfect precision, exactly how little she thought of his threat. Her needle was still threaded, still catching the late afternoon light slanting through the single west-facing window, and her fingers were absolutely steady. "You can lock me up," she said, her voice carrying that low, unhurried cadence that people who did not know her mistook for meekness. "But then you will never know whose men are riding for the Blackridge Syndicate, and 4 soldiers will be dead by Tuesday." The room went utterly silent. Luke Townsend was standing near the far wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set at the particular angle it assumed when he was working very hard to conceal the fact that his entire world had just tilted sideways. He had known Abigail Alden for 11 days. He had spent roughly 8 of those days dismissing her as the Outpost seamstress, a woman who mended saddle leather and let out jacket seams, and occasionally patched the canvas of supply wagons. He had spent the other 3 days being progressively, unsettlingly wrong about that assessment. The leather saddlebag on the table had belonged to a dead man. It had been examined by 2 Army lieutenants, a civilian scout, and Marshal Hennessy himself. None of them had seen what Abigail saw. None of them had looked at the saddle stitching with eyes trained to read thread the way a scholar reads text. The hidden pattern she had found there was going to change everything. But the story of how she found it, and what finding it cost, and what it gave her in return, had begun 11 days ago on a road choked with red Wyoming dust, when a man on a black horse rode into her life like trouble always arrived in the territory, fast and without apology. The summer of 1878 had come to Fort Laramie like a fever. The grass on the high plains was burning gold 2 months before it should have, and the Laramie River ran lower than anyone with 30 years of memory in the territory had seen it. The Army garrison at the fort was stretched thin, with half its complement rotated south to deal with tensions along the New Mexico border, and the civilian settlement that had grown up around the post walls was doing what civilian settlements always did when military authority felt distant. It was getting complicated. Abigail had come to Fort Laramie the previous October, when the wife of the post sutler had sent east for a seamstress who could do fine work. Mrs. Haverson had wanted a woman who could make the sort of dresses that might remind her she had once lived somewhere more civilized than Wyoming territory. What she had gotten in Abigail was someone considerably more than that, though she had not known it at the time, and neither had anyone else. Abigail Alden was 26 years old in that summer of 1878. She had been born in Philadelphia to a tailor father who treated his craft with the same serious devotion a mathematician brings to a proof. Thomas Alden had taught his daughter that fabric was a language, that every thread had tension and intention, that a seam could tell you the truth about the person who made it if you knew how to listen. He had taught her to read pattern the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, with reverence and with rigor, and Abigail had proven an extraordinary student. She had apprenticed in a sail-making concern in Baltimore for 2 years, then worked for a military uniform contractor in Washington for another 3, where she had learned something crucial. The Army had specifications for its stitching. Regulations about the number of stitches per inch, the weight of thread to be used, the color and pattern of reinforcing seams on pockets, cartridge pouches, and saddlebags issued to different ranks. She had memorized those specifications the way a spy memorizes a cipher. Not because she planned to use that knowledge, simply because her mind did not let things go once it had taken hold of them. When she arrived in Wyoming territory, She brought that same mind and applied it to the frontier versions of her craft. Saddle repair was a significant part of her work. The men at Fort Laramie rode hard and cared less about the condition of their equipment than they should have, and a cracked saddle skirt or a failing cinch strap could kill a man as surely as a bullet. She learned the specific stitching signatures of every saddle maker and leather worker within 100 miles. She knew which shops in Cheyenne used waxed linen thread and which used cotton. She knew the particular backstitch pattern that old Augusto Miles put on every piece that came out of his shop in Rawlins, as distinctive as a signature. She worked out of a single room behind the sutler's store, which smelled of leather oil and beeswax and the particular combination of sage and wood smoke that seemed to permeate everything in Wyoming eventually. She had a heavy work table, 4 spools of thread in varying weights, a collection of curved needles for leatherwork, and a lamp she kept burning late into most evenings. The soldiers who came to her with work to be done were polite enough to her face and dismissive enough behind her back. She was the seamstress. She fixed things. She was not the sort of person who needed to be taken seriously beyond the dimensions of that fact. Abigail was entirely accustomed to this, and she had long since made her peace with it. Let them dismiss her. The thread did not care whether anyone took her seriously. The pattern in the leather did not require their acknowledgement to exist. Luke Townsend rode into Fort Laramie on the first morning of June, with a dead man's horse on a lead rope, and an expression on his face that belonged to someone carrying a weight he had not yet figured out how to set down. He was a contract scout for the Army, which meant he operated in the space between civilian and military authority that was either very free or very dangerous depending on the week. He was 32 years old, built with the lean, hard economy of a man who had spent the better part of his adult life outdoors in conditions that had no patience for excess. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw carried several days of shadow, and he had light gray eyes that noticed things in a way that sometimes made the people he was looking at uncomfortable. He had found the dead man 2 days' ride south of the fort, at the bottom of a dry gulch where he had apparently fallen or been thrown from his horse. The man had no identification on his person, which was suspicious. His saddlebag contained a collection of items that told Luke very little on their own, but suggested in their combination that the man had been carrying something of significance. There was a small amount of Union currency. There was a scrap of paper with coordinates written on it in a neat hand. There was a folding knife of a pattern Luke did not recognize, and a piece of hard tack that had been wrapped very carefully in oilcloth, which struck him as an oddly precious treatment for field rations. He had brought the body to the fort's medical officer and the saddlebag to the commanding officer, and then he had stood in that office for 40 minutes while Lieutenant Colonel Graves examined the contents with a frown that deepened by degrees. "Syndicate," Graves said finally. "Every instinct I have says syndicate," Luke agreed. The Blackridge Syndicate was the collective name used in Army and Marshal Service circles for a network of criminal operators who had been running a systematic operation across Wyoming and Colorado territories for the better part of 2 years. They moved stolen cattle, intercepted supply shipments, and occasionally ran guns to whichever parties in various regional conflicts were in a position to pay for them. They were organized in a way that most frontier criminal enterprises were not, and they were careful in a way that had kept anyone from getting a clear picture of who was running them. "What I cannot tell you," Graves continued, "is whether this man was syndicate or working against them, and until I know that, I cannot know who to trust with this bag." He had assigned Luke to treat the saddlebag as evidence and to handle it carefully while he sent word to Marshal Hennessy, who was in Cheyenne and would need 3 or 4 days to arrive. Luke had put the saddlebag in his quarters, slept with it under his cot, and spent a largely unproductive day and a half staring at its contents in different configurations trying to make them tell him something. It was on the second morning that he crossed paths with Abigail Alden. He had come to the sutler's store for tobacco and a new length of rope, and she had been standing behind the counter because Mrs. Haverson had gone to attend a neighbor woman's confinement and someone had needed to mind the store. Abigail was serving him with the efficient, impersonal competence she brought to most transactions, and Luke was paying no particular attention to her beyond the ordinary acknowledgement due any person, when his eye happened to land on the piece of leather work spread on her worktable through the open doorway behind the counter. It was a saddle skirt she was repairing, and she was doing something with the replacement stitching that he had never seen a leather worker do before. She was matching the original stitch pattern with what appeared to be absolute precision, following the old holes with her curved needle so that the repair would be invisible to any eye that did not know to look for it. "You matched that," he said, before he quite intended to speak. She looked up from his change, which she had been counting with the sort of careful attention most people reserved for important documents. "I beg your pardon. The stitching on that repair. You matched the original pattern, the spacing, the angle. Most leather workers just do their own pattern when they make a repair." She regarded him for a moment with a measuring expression. "Most leather workers do not understand that the original pattern is information," she said. "Matching it preserves the integrity of what the maker originally said." Luke was quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable. "What the maker originally said," he repeated. "Stitching is a language, Mr." She paused. "Townsend," he said. "Luke Townsend. Mr. Townsend. Every leather worker has a signature in their stitching, the number of stitches per inch, the direction of the cross thread, the tension they use, which shows up in how the leather responds at each stitch point. If you know what to look for, you can read a piece of saddle work the way you would read handwriting." He looked at her for a longer moment than he normally would have. "You can tell who made a piece of leather work just by looking at the stitching." "Not always, but often, yes. And I can certainly tell you when a piece has been made by more than one person, or when it has been altered, or when the stitching does not match the stated origin of the piece." She said this with the particular matter-of-factness of someone who considers the extraordinary entirely ordinary. Luke paid for his tobacco and his rope. He walked back toward the officers' quarters with the dead man's saddlebag very present in his mind, and a new and specific thought beginning to form in his chest like a slow ember catching. He went back to the sutler's store that afternoon. Abigail was alone, working by her lamp despite the fact that there was still plenty of daylight coming through the door. The piece on her table was a cavalry cartridge pouch with a broken gusset seam, standard Army issue. "Miss Alden," he said, "I have a question about a piece of leather work, an unusual one." She set down her needle without hurrying. "What sort of question?" He put the saddlebag on her table. She looked at it. She did not touch it immediately. She studied it the way a physician studies a patient's face before asking a single question, gathering initial information. Then she looked up at him. "Where did this come from?" "A dead man. Found him in a gulch south of here 2 days ago. No identification. The bag was the only thing he had." "You are a scout, contract, Army, and you think there is something in the stitching." It was not quite a question, he noticed that. "I don't know what I think," he said honestly. "That's why I'm here." She pulled the lamp closer and leaned over the bag with a focused attention that transformed her expression entirely. The ordinary seamstress pleasantness dropped away, and in its place was something precise and intent, the face of someone doing serious work. She turned the bag slowly, examining the seams at the back, then the side gussets, then the top edge where the flap was attached. She did not speak for several minutes. "This bag," she said finally, "was issued by the Army. You can see the standard quartermaster's stitch specification on the main body seams. 11 stitches per inch, saddle stitch, waxed linen thread, brown, standard issue from roughly 1872 onward." "All right," Luke said. He had not known that. "But these seams here," she touched the leather without pointing, simply with the tip of one finger gliding along a seam line on the inner flap of the bag, "were added later. The thread is the same color, but it is a different weight, cotton, not linen, and the stitch count is different, 13 per inch, and the direction of the top thread alternates in a pattern that is not random. The ember in Luke's chest caught fully. Not random. No, she straightened and looked at him directly. Someone stitched a message into this bag. The alternating stitch direction, read in sequence, codes to a series of marks. I would need time to work out what the sequence represents, but it is unquestionably deliberate. The variation is too consistent to be accidental. Luke stood very still. How long would you need to decode it? That depends on whether it uses a standard cipher or something original. Give me until tomorrow morning. He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in the architecture of his assessment of her. It was a small structural change, but it was fundamental. Like a single keystroke that changes everything that follows. You understand, he said carefully, that this is connected to something that may be dangerous. I understand that a man is dead and you found him without identification, she said. I am not naive, Mr. Townsend. No, he said, I'm beginning to see that you are not. He left the saddlebag with her. He did not sleep well that night. Part of that was the familiar restlessness that had been his companion for years, the particular inability to be still that came from too long spent in places where stillness was a liability. But part of it was the seamstress in the room behind the sutler's store and what she was doing, and what the doing of it might mean. He found himself thinking about the precise, unhurried way she moved, nothing wasted, everything intentional. He found himself thinking about what she had said. The stitching is a language. The original pattern is information. He had been looking at the wrong language entirely. Abigail worked by lamplight until past midnight, and then woke before dawn and worked again. The bag was spread flat on her table, and she had a piece of paper beside it on which she was mapping the sequence of alternating stitches on the inner flap seam. Every time the stitch direction varied from the standard, she marked it. She worked left to right, top to bottom, the way she had been trained to read fabric. By the time the sky outside her small window was going from black to the particular blue-gray that preceded sunrise, she had a string of marks on her paper that resolved, with the application of a code structure she had encountered once in her time in Washington, into something readable. Not words, coordinates and something else. Names, 4 names, and a date that was 9 days away. She sat very still for a moment with the paper in front of her. The lamp was burning low, and the room smelled of leather, and the lamp oil and her own long night of concentrated effort. Outside, she could hear the fort beginning its morning routine, the distant sound of the cavalry bugler running through the reveille call. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her apron pocket. Then she re-rolled the saddlebag and set it in the center of her table where Luke Townsend would see it the moment he walked in. He arrived before she had finished her first cup of coffee, which she had made on the small iron stove in the corner of her workroom. He knocked twice, which she noted. Most of the men who came to her with work knocked once or not at all. "Come in," she said. He looked at the rolled saddlebag, then at her. He read her face with an accuracy that she found, in retrospect, should have told her something about him. "You found something. Sit down, Mr. Townsend." He sat on the single wooden chair she kept beside the worktable, which put him slightly below her eye level in a way she suspected most men would have found uncomfortable. He did not appear to find it anything. She laid the paper on the table between them. "The inner flap seam contains a coded message," she said. "The alternation of stitch direction from the standard pattern creates a sequence of binary marks. I applied the simplest possible cipher structure, which turned out to be the correct one, because the message does not appear designed to withstand sophisticated code breaking. It was designed to be found only by someone who knew what to look for in the first place. And what does it say?" She pointed to the paper. 4 names and a set of coordinates and a date. The coordinates place a location approximately 40 miles south-southwest of here, in the Platte River breaks. The date is 9 days from yesterday, which makes it 8 days from today. Luke stared at the paper. His jaw set in that way she would come to recognize over the days ahead as the sign that he was processing something significant and controlling his reaction to it with deliberate effort. "These names," he said quietly. He was looking at the paper with an expression she could not read yet. "Do you recognize any of them?" She pointed to the second name on the list. "That name is a captain at this garrison," she said. "Captain Edwin Morse." Luke looked up from the paper and met her eyes, and for a moment they simply regarded each other across the narrow worktable in the early morning light, with the full weight of what that meant settling between them. "The man in the gulch," Abigail said, "was either trying to get this information to someone, or he was carrying it somewhere and someone made sure he never arrived. Either way," Luke said slowly, "someone in this garrison may be feeding information to the Blackridge Syndicate, and they have met with the Syndicate or are planning to at that location in 8 days. That is my reading of it, yes." He sat back in the chair and looked at her with an expression she would spend a considerable amount of time thinking about afterward. It was not the look of a man who was surprised to find a woman capable of intelligent deduction. It was deeper than that. It was the look of someone whose entire frame of reference has been quietly reorganized by the presence of a specific person, and who is only now becoming conscious of the reorganization. "Miss Alden," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Then ask it directly." "Why did you tell me this? You could have kept quiet. You could have told me there was nothing in the stitching. You would have been safer." She looked at him for a beat. "Safer than what?" "I did not know what this information would be when I agreed to look. By the time I knew what it was, not reporting it would have made me complicit in whatever the syndicate is planning. I am not in the business of complicity, Mr. Townsend, and if it makes you a target, then I suppose I will deal with that when it becomes necessary." She picked up her coffee cup. "I have a question for you in return." "Go ahead." "What are you going to do with this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Report it to the commanding officer and wait for Hennessy." "And if the commanding officer is also compromised?" He stared at her. It was a thought he had clearly not yet reached, and she watched him follow it to its logical terminus, and she watched his expression change as he arrived there. "Graves," he said flatly. "I have no evidence that Colonel Graves is involved," she said carefully. "I have evidence that Captain Morse may be. Those are different things, but you asked the right question when you came to me with this bag rather than taking it directly to the chain of command." "I came to you because I thought you could tell me about the leather," he said. "You came to me because your instincts told you not to trust the official channels completely," she said. "That is not nothing, Mr. Townsend. Trust those instincts." He looked at her for the third time with that particular quality of attention, and this time she let herself fully register what was in it. Respect, pure and ungarnished and entirely real. She had received various forms of respect from various men in her life. The polite, conditional respect that men offered women when women stayed in their designated spaces. The performative respect that superiors in Washington had offered her during inspections of uniform work she had done, which really meant respect for the product and not the producer. This was different. This was the respect one capable person holds for another capable person when they have just witnessed something genuinely impressive. She found it unexpectedly affecting. "All right," he said. "I will tell Graves enough to get Hennessy notified and here faster. Not everything, just enough to justify the urgency. Can I trust you to keep this between us in the meantime?" "You can trust me," she said. He stood. He was a tall man, she noticed again, and in the close confines of her workroom his physical presence was considerable in a way that was not at all unpleasant. She was also aware, with the particular clarity she brought to most things, that she was noticing this, and that noticing it was a departure from her usual disciplined relationship with her own reactions. He picked up the saddlebag from the table and then stopped. "The paper," he said. She had already thought of this. "I made a copy." She opened the drawer of her worktable and took out a second sheet on which she had reproduced the decoded sequence. "You keep yours, I keep mine. If something happens to one of us, the information still exists." He took the paper. He folded it and put it inside his coat. He looked at her one more time. "Miss Alden, thank you. Find out who is behind the pattern," she said. "That will be thanks enough." The days that followed were both the most quietly tense and the most unexpectedly rich that Abigail had experienced since coming west. Luke came to her workroom every morning on the pretext of having some piece of kit mended or adjusted, a reasonable cover given that he was genuinely hard on his equipment and genuinely did need periodic repairs. They spoke for 30 or 40 minutes each morning in the low, careful voices of people who understand that walls are thin and attention is unpredictable. He told her what he had learned from Graves, who had received his partial report with appropriate gravity and had sent a rider to Cheyenne to hasten Hennessy's arrival. He told her what he had found when he began, quietly and without alerting Captain Morse, to watch the patterns of the garrison's communication. And Abigail, for her part, told him things she observed from her own particular vantage point, which was more useful than either of them had initially credited. The seamstress's workroom was a place where men came with their equipment and talked while they waited, the way men talk in barbershops or livery stables, in the relaxed assumption that the person doing the service work in the corner is not really listening or does not really count. She had been passively collecting this ambient intelligence for months. Now she applied it deliberately. She told him that Private Halloran had received a letter 3 weeks ago from an address in Denver that he had carefully not mentioned to anyone, which she knew because she had happened to be in the sutler's store when the mail arrived, and had noticed him pocket the letter with a speed that suggested he did not want it seen. She told him that the civilian contractor who had recently delivered a supply of leather goods to the garrison had spent considerably longer than necessary in Captain Morse's office on the day of delivery, which she knew because his wagon had been sitting outside the officers' quarters unattended for over an hour, and she had eventually gone to check whether the brake was set on account of the slope of the parade ground. Luke listened to these things with a focused attention that, she observed, he gave equally to information from any source. He had none of the habit, common among the men she had known, of filtering intelligence through the gender of the person offering it. He evaluated what she told him on its merits, asked follow-up questions that were intelligent and specific, and integrated her observations with his own in a synthesis that was, she found, genuinely collaborative in a way she had not expected. On the 4th morning, she realized she had begun looking forward to these conversations in a way that extended beyond the investigation. She identified this fact, examined it honestly, and did not immediately dismiss it. She was 26, not 16, and she was not in the habit of pretending that her interior states were other than what they were. Luke Townsend was an unusually capable man in a territory full of capable men, but his capability was complemented by something less common. He was interested in her, not in the way that translated to presumption or inconvenient pursuit, but genuinely interested, the way an intelligent person is interested in another intelligent person's mind. He asked her questions about her work, about how she had learned to read stitching, about her time in Washington. He listened to the answers. On the 5th morning, he brought her coffee. He appeared at her workroom door with 2 cups from the garrison cookhouse, carrying them in large hands with the careful balance of someone who has handled fragile things in rough conditions. He set one on the corner of her worktable without comment, as though it were a perfectly ordinary thing to do, and took his usual seat in the wooden chair. She looked at the coffee and then at him. "Thank you," she said. "The cookhouse makes it too strong," he said. "I've found that helps with early mornings." "I prefer it strong," she said. He looked at her with a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that she had not seen before. It changed his face considerably. "Of course you do," he said. She felt something warm move through her chest that she catalogued accurately and without alarm and set carefully to one side, because there was work to do, and she was not the sort of person who let warmth displace work. But she catalogued it. By the 6th day, they had established that Captain Morse had been meeting regularly with the civilian contractor, that 3 of the 4 names on the decoded list were connected to garrison personnel, and that the 4th name, A civilian designation she had initially found opaque, belonged to a regional land agent whose office in Cheyenne held the deed records for roughly a quarter of the territory. The syndicate was not just moving cattle and supplies. They were building towards something that involved land title, which in 1878 Wyoming meant they were thinking about the railroads. They are positioning to control land grants along the projected rail corridor, Abigail said on the morning of the 6th day, spreading out the map she had borrowed from the sutler's store and marking the coordinates from the decoded message against the proposed rail line she had reconstructed from what she had read in various newspapers over the past year. If they own or control the land, they control what the railroad pays to cross it. That is not a small criminal enterprise. That is systematic territorial theft. Luke stared at the map. How did you know about the rail corridor projection? I read, she said simply. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the one she had first seen on the morning she had laid the decoded paper on the table between them, reorganized, recalibrated. She realized she had become, in some quiet and fundamental way, important to how he understood the situation they were in. Not as a resource to be consulted, but as a partner to be relied on. Abigail, he said. She noticed he had stopped using Miss Alden somewhere around the 4th day and had moved to her given name in a gradual, natural way that had not felt like presumption when it happened. Luke, when this is over, he said, when Hennessy gets here and we sort out Morse and get to the bottom of whatever is being planned at those coordinates, I want to ask you something. She kept her expression neutral, though the warmth in her chest returned with somewhat more insistence than she had budgeted for. Then ask it when the time is right. Fair enough, he said, and he turned back to the map. Marshal Hennessy arrived on the 7th day, a day earlier than expected, which suggested that Graves's rider had communicated adequate urgency. He came into Fort Laramie with 3 deputies, and he came in with the pre-existing conviction that he already understood the situation, which was a quality in him that Abigail assessed and categorized as a liability within approximately 4 minutes of meeting him. Luke brought Hennessy to the Outpost, to the sutler's store, because it was the most neutral ground available, and Abigail was introduced as the person who had decoded the Saddlebag message. Hennessy had looked at her with the particular assessment men of his type applied to women in professional contexts, the brief calculation of how much weight to give what she was about to say, filtered through assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual competence. She ignored this in the focused, deliberate way she had learned to ignore it over the previous decade, and simply laid out what she had found, in precise and specific detail, with the paper and the map and the decoded sequence. She spoke for 12 minutes without interruption. When she finished, Hennessy looked at the materials on the table and then at Luke. "She's right," Luke said, before the marshal could redirect his attention away from Abigail in search of confirmation from a source he found easier to credit. "Every element checks out. I have spent the last 6 days independently verifying what she decoded. The meeting at those coordinates is in 2 days. Morse is involved, possibly others." Hennessy had then made his threat, the pointed finger and the locked-up speech, which was not, Abigail had concluded, genuine menace, but rather the reflexive assertion of authority by a man who felt his authority had been obscured by the competence of someone he had not expected to be competent. She had responded in the way she had calculated would be most effective, which was not deference and not aggression, but simply the clear statement of stakes that made irrelevance of his posturing. 4 soldiers will be dead by Tuesday. She knew this because the coordinates and the date, when she had worked through the tactical implications with Luke the previous day, placed a supply escort from the garrison at a particular crossing point at a time that coincided exactly with the syndicate meeting. The escort did not know what it was riding into. The meeting location covered the crossing. If the syndicate wanted to simultaneously eliminate witnesses and demonstrate operational capacity to new partners, the escort was a natural target. The room was silent after her words. Then Hennessy sat down. "Tell me exactly," he said, and his voice had changed. "What you believe is going to happen at those coordinates." She told him. The plan they devised over the following 3 hours involved Hennessy's 3 deputies, Luke, 2 soldiers who Graves had personally vouched for, and who were not connected by any thread of acquaintance or communication to Morse or any of the other named parties, and a strategic rerouting of the supply escort to take it out of harm's way without alerting Morse that anything had changed. Abigail's part in the plan, as Hennessy initially conceived it, was to have ended at the information provision stage. She was to have given her decoded intelligence and returned to her workroom, where she would have been safely out of the way. Luke had other thoughts on this. "She needs to come," he said, and he said it with the calm flatness of someone who has already decided and is informing rather than requesting. They were outside the sutler's store in the early evening, the sky going through the spectacular color show that the Wyoming high plains performed every sunset, the kind of beauty that came at you sideways and hit harder than you expected. Hennessy had bristled. "She is a civilian." "So am I," Luke said. "So are your deputies." "She is a woman," Hennessy tried. "She is the only person who can confirm on-site identification of stitched syndicate marks," Luke said, because Abigail had told him that morning that the syndicate appeared to use the same hidden stitch code on its internal correspondence, which she had noticed on a piece of saddle work that had come through her shop from the civilian contractor. If they were going to positively connect the men at those coordinates to the broader network, they needed someone who could read the physical evidence in the moment. "And she is capable." Hennessy had looked at Abigail, who had returned his look with perfect equanimity. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I have been riding since I was 8 years old," she said. "I am not a spectacular rider, but I am a reliable one, which is more useful in circumstances like these." He had acquiesced with the poorly concealed grace of a man who cannot construct a logical objection. They rode out the following morning, before the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge, in a group that was carefully assembled to look like a routine patrol. Luke rode beside Abigail, which had been the natural arrangement, and which neither of them had orchestrated or commented on. The Wyoming morning was enormous around them, the sky a blue that had no eastern equivalent, the sage-covered breaks falling away on either side of the trail in waves of silver green. They rode in relative quiet. There was not much to say that had not already been said, and the silence between them had taken on, over the past several days, a quality that Abigail had found herself noticing. It was comfortable. It did not ask anything of her. Most silences, in her experience, asked women to fill them with something palatable, some softening conversation that made the men around them more comfortable. This silence simply existed and was perfectly fine with her existing in it. "Are you all right?" Luke asked after they had ridden perhaps a mile. "I am," she glanced at him. "Are you?" "I am usually all right before something like this," he said. "It's the hours after that take some adjusting." "Does it happen often, this sort of thing?" "Often enough." He looked at the horizon, which was their common habit, she noticed. Both of them tended to look outward when they were thinking about something inward. "Not often enough that it gets easier." She considered this. "That seems like a reasonable way to be. Most people think scouts are supposed to be hard about it, unaffected. Most people are wrong about most things," she said. He looked at her sidelong, and the corner of his mouth made that slight, private curve that she had catalogued with some care. "You have a very direct way of saying things. I find it saves time." "It does," he agreed. "I like it." She kept her eyes on the horizon, but she was aware of a warmth at the center of her chest that was becoming increasingly difficult to set to one side as she had been setting it. She did not try to set it aside this time. She simply let it exist and rode with it. The Platte River breaks were rough country, cut through by the river's old courses into a landscape of sudden drops and blind gulches that were beautiful in the way of things that do not care about your comfort. They came to the coordinates by a circuitous route that Hennessy's lead deputy knew from previous service in the area, approaching the meeting site from the high ground to the east, which put the sun behind them and their view clear. They held their positions on the high ground while Luke and the lead deputy worked their way down into a position where they could observe without being observed. Abigail stayed with the group, which she had agreed to and which was tactically sound. Her role would come after, in the processing of any physical evidence recovered. The wait was the hardest part. She was not a person accustomed to inaction. She occupied the time by reviewing the stitch sequences she had memorized, running through them mentally the way a musician runs through passages before a performance. The confrontation at the coordinates was briefer and less dramatic than the tension of the previous days had made her expect. The syndicate's men arrived, 6 of them, and Captain Morse arrived separately, and Hennessy's group descended from 3 directions at once. There were shots fired, 3 in total, none of which connected with anyone in Hennessy's party. Morse was taken alive and in a state of collapse that suggested he had known, somewhere in himself, that the situation was always going to resolve this way. 2 of the syndicate men were also taken. The remaining 4 fled south. Abigail came down from the high ground when the shooting was done and went directly to the evidence that had been on the syndicate men's horses. She found, on the saddlebag of the man she was fairly certain was the syndicate's regional coordinator, exactly what she had expected to find. The same stitch code used on the bag from the dead man in the gulch. She read it in place, on her knees in the Wyoming dirt with the sun at a sharp angle and dust in her eyes, and what it told her was the name of the syndicate's principal organizer, a man whose name would later prove to be an established figure in Cheyenne's legal and land-dealing community, whose surface respectability had made him very difficult to suspect. She told Hennessy what she had found, reading the stitch sequence aloud for his deputy to transcribe. Hennessy listened to her this time, without any of the reflexive authority assertion. He simply listened and wrote down what his deputy transcribed, and at the end of it said, with a bluntness that was its own form of respect, "You were right about all of it." "The seamstress was right about all of it," she corrected, not unkindly, because the precise statement of it mattered. He met her eyes and understood what she meant and had the grace to look briefly, as though he did not take that entirely well. Then he nodded once and turned to his deputies to begin the process of securing the prisoners for the ride back to Laramie. Luke was beside her before she quite registered that he had moved. He had a canteen and he offered it to her, and she took it and drank and handed it back, and they stood for a moment in the still aftermath of what had just happened, with the prisoners being managed 50 yards away and the Platte breaks spread out around them in their indifferent, enormous beauty. "Are you all right?" he asked for the second time that day. "I told you I was," she said. "You are covered in Wyoming," he said, looking at the dust on her dress and her hands. She looked down at herself. "So I am, Miss Alden." He had returned to the formal address, but he said it in a tone that was not formal at all. He said it the way a person says a name they have been thinking about. "Mr. Townsend," she said in the same tone. "I said I had something to ask you when this was over. You did say that. It's over." He was looking at her with those light gray eyes that notice things, and what they were noticing right now was her with a focused and uncomplicated attention that she found, at this particular moment with the dust settling around them and the high Wyoming sky above, quite overwhelming in the very best way. "Then ask," she said. "There is a social at the garrison on Friday," he said. "The kind where there is fiddle music and Mrs. Haverson's terrible cider, and everyone stands around looking uncomfortable for an hour before they actually start dancing. I would like to go with you if you are willing." She looked at him for a moment in which she was conscious of approximately 4 different things simultaneously: the quality of the light, the dust on her hands, the specific timbre of the earnestness in his voice, and the fact that the warmth she had been cataloging and setting aside and letting exist for the past 11 days had just resolved itself into something that was no longer compatible with being set aside. "I am willing," she said. He smiled. It was a full smile this time, not the private corner curve she had cataloged, but a real and open one, and it did something significant to the structure of his face, making him look younger and also somehow more fully himself, as though the smile was the natural state and the habitual seriousness was the overlay. She discovered that she was smiling back, which was also not something she usually did without noticing in the process. They rode back to Fort Laramie in the late afternoon, with the prisoners secured and the evidence catalogued, and the conversation between them on the return ride was the most natural Abigail had experienced in longer than she could immediately quantify. They talked about the case, and then about the territory, and then about other things entirely. The kind of other things that surface when two people have established that the more serious conversation can be had whenever it needs to be. And so, the space between serious conversations can be filled with something lighter and equally genuine. He told her that he had grown up in Kansas, on a cattle operation that his family had run until a combination of drought and bad debt had ended it when he was 17. He had spent his young adulthood doing what the frontier offered young men who needed income and had useful outdoor skills, which had eventually led him to scouting contracts with the Army. He did not describe this history with either self-pity or the false bravado that she had noticed in men who were trying to impress. He described it plainly, as the sequence of events it was. She told him about Philadelphia and her father's shop and the particular education she had gotten there, and about Baltimore and Washington and eventually Wyoming. She told him about the uniform contractor in Washington who had paid her less than the male workers doing comparable work and had framed this, when she raised it, as a function of her gender rather than her output, and how she had left that position the following week because she had concluded that no amount of interesting work was worth the sustained message that her work was worth less because of who she was. Smart, he said. Necessary, she said. I am not built for situations that require me to accept that framing. No, he said. You are not. He said it with the quality she had identified as genuine respect, and which never failed to do something to the middle of her chest. What brought you to Wyoming specifically, after Washington? Mrs. Haverson's advertisement was the immediate cause, she said, but I had been thinking about going west for some time. I wanted to be somewhere that was still being built. In cities that were already made, the space for a woman who was not interested in fitting the established shape was very small. I thought perhaps the frontier might have a different relationship with usefulness. Does it? She considered this honestly. In some ways. In others, the frontier imports its attitudes along with everything else. She paused, but I have been given more room here than I expected. He was quiet for a moment. More room than you were given in Washington. More room than most places, she said. The territory is not without its injustices. What happened to the Lakota and the Cheyenne on this land is not something I have found a way to reconcile myself with, and I do not think the honest answer is to pretend it is not part of what surrounds us out here. But within that reality, yes, there is room here, for work and for being taken on one's merits at least sometimes. She paused again. You take people on their merits. I try to, he said. I've been wrong about it before. You were wrong about me initially, she said, because she had no investment in pretending otherwise. I was, he said without deflection. I had looked at the fact of what you did and not at how you did it. That was my error. It is a common error. That doesn't make it less of an error, he said. She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, his posture easy in the saddle with the particular unconscious competence of a man who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback, and the late afternoon light was very kind to the line of his jaw. She was cataloging things about him, she realized, with the same quality of attention she brought to a complex piece of leather work. The specific way he moved, the way his voice changed when he said something he considered important. The precise quality of his listening. She did not try to stop cataloging. There did not seem to be much point. Back at the garrison, the prisoners were lodged and Hennessy began his formal processing of the case. Abigail wrote out a detailed account of her decoding methodology at his request, which she did at her worktable that evening in the focused, careful way she did all written work, specifying the exact stitch sequence, the cipher structure she had identified, and the step-by-step process by which she had arrived at the decoded content. She made 3 copies. Hennessy got 1, Graves got 1, and she kept 1. She had learned enough about the way official processes worked to understand that documentation was its own form of protection. The following 2 days were occupied by the formal interviews, the transportation of the prisoners toward Cheyenne, and the administrative aftermath of an investigation that had concluded successfully, which involved a great deal more paperwork than the investigation itself. Abigail was consulted several times by Hennessy's deputies and by the Army's own investigative personnel, who arrived on the 2nd day from Cheyenne and were, she was pleased to find, somewhat more immediately prepared to take her seriously than Hennessy had initially been. Captain Morse had, in the course of his interview, provided a fairly complete account of the syndicate's operations in exchange for considerations regarding his circumstances, and the Cheyenne land agent, whose name she had read from the Saddlebag stitching, was arrested at his office on the 2nd day. The supply escort that would have been ambushed at the coordinates had been rerouted without incident, and its commanding officer had been informed of what had been prepared for him, a conversation that Luke had described to her as sobering in the extreme. The 4 soldiers who might have been dead by Tuesday were alive. She allowed herself, privately, to feel the full weight of that fact. The garrison social on Friday evening was held in the largest of the post buildings, which had been cleared of its usual furniture and decorated, with the optimistic effort that characterized garrison social events, with bunting that had seen better days and a collection of wildflowers in tin cups placed along the windowsills. The fiddle music was provided by a private who played with genuine, if somewhat erratic talent, and Mrs. Haverson's cider was indeed precisely as terrible as Luke had promised. Abigail wore the best dress she owned, which was a dark blue wool chally that she had made herself from a pattern she had adapted from a fashion plate she had seen 2 years ago, fitted in the way she knew how to fit things, which was very well. She had put her hair up with particular attention. She was not vain, but she was precise, and she brought the same precision to the assembling of herself that she brought to everything else. Luke arrived at the sutler's store to walk with her to the social hall, and when she came to the door, he stopped for a moment and looked at her with an expression that was uncomplicated and entirely flattering. He had cleaned up considerably himself and was wearing a jacket she had not seen before, dark brown, well-fitted. She wondered who had tailored it and found herself looking automatically at the seams. "You are examining the jacket," he said. "The seaming is interesting," she said. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh fully before. It was a good sound, genuine and without performance. "What does the seaming tell you?" "That whoever made it knew what they were doing and that it was made somewhere with access to reasonable quality wool broadcloth, probably Denver or Cheyenne, within the last several years." She looked up from the jacket to his face. "And that you look very well in it." He held out his arm with the formality that the occasion suggested, and the ease of a man who was comfortable with both formality and its absence. "Shall we?" She took his arm. The social was the kind of simple, earnest gathering that the frontier produced when it tried to maintain the social fabric of the places its inhabitants had come from, and there was something that she found unexpectedly affecting about that effort. The rough bunting and the tin-cup flowers and the energetic if imperfect fiddle music were all expressions of a genuine desire to have evenings that were about something other than the difficulty of the day-to-day. She found herself warming to the gathering in a way she had not anticipated. They danced. Luke danced with a focused competence that she suspected was applied rather than natural, but which was entirely effective. He led with a clear signal and adjusted for her responses, and did not, at any point, apologize for his dancing in the self-deprecating way that men who were actually uncertain about it often did. They moved through 2 square dances and then a slower piece that the fiddler played with unexpected grace, and in the slower piece they were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and the hand at her back was steady. "You are thinking about something," he said. "I am usually thinking about something," she said. "Something specific." She looked up at him. "I am thinking that the last several days have been the most genuinely useful I have felt since I came to Wyoming territory." "Useful," he said, with a slight lift in his voice that indicated he was turning the word over. "I mean it sincerely," she said. "Not useful in the sense of having been used. Useful in the sense of having done something that mattered. That the thing I know how to do was the thing that was needed. It was very much the thing that was needed," he said. He paused. "Abigail, yes, I want to be honest with you about something. Then be honest. I came here 3 years ago because I needed work," he said. "And I stayed because the scouting contracts were good, and I had not yet found a reason to think about staying that had anything to do with something other than work. And in 11 days, you have become the most significant reason I have come across to think about what I do next and where I do it." She held his gaze through the length of this statement and did not look away. The fiddle music moved around them, and the other dancers moved around them. And in the middle of it, she felt entirely still in the way she sometimes felt when she was in the center of a complex problem that she had finally understood completely. "That is a significant thing to say," she said. "I know it is. I am not going to be a woman who makes herself smaller to be easier to carry," she said. "I want you to understand that as a fact and not a warning." "I would not want you to be," he said with a quiet directness that she found completely credible. "I am not looking for someone smaller, I am looking for someone real." She was quiet for a moment. "I think you may have found one," she said. The smile came back. "The full one." She felt the answering warmth in her own expression and did not attempt to moderate it. The dance ended and they went to stand near one of the windows where the evening air came through and cooled the flush of dancing. Mrs. Haverson appeared beside them with 2 cups of her terrible cider and a beaming expression that communicated, without any ambiguity, that she had opinions about what she was observing and considered them favorable. Abigail accepted the cider and took a polite sip and managed her expression with professionalism. Luke's expression was considerably less managed. He looked into the cup with an honest grimace that he caught and converted, not quite in time, to something more neutral. "It's very distinctive," Abigail said. "It is something," he agreed. They looked at each other and both, very nearly simultaneously, began to laugh. In the weeks and months that followed, the patterns of their days rearranged themselves around a new center. Luke's scouting contracts brought him away from the fort with some regularity, but the intervals between his returns had, she noticed, become somewhat shorter than they had been before their involvement. He did not announce this or make it a declaration. He simply appeared more often, and when he was at the fort, he was frequently in the vicinity of the sutler's store with varying degrees of plausibility in his stated reasons. She did not pretend not to notice this, and she did not pretend not to be glad of it. He brought her things he found in the field that he thought she would find interesting, which was a form of attention that she valued highly, because it demonstrated something specific about how he was thinking of her. A piece of old leather work with an unusual stitch pattern he had found at an abandoned campsite, which turned out to be from a Mexican tradition she had not previously encountered, and which occupied her happily for an entire evening. A detailed map of the southwestern territory that he had been given by a Shoshone guide, and which was accurate in ways that the Army's official maps were not. A small piece of turquoise he had found in a dry creek bed that was exactly the color of the Wyoming sky at its best hour. She kept the turquoise on her work table. She continued her work, and she made it better. The knowledge that she had applied in the syndicate investigation had sharpened her attention to the coded languages in all leather work, and she began, in the months following, to formalize what she knew into a systematic framework. She wrote it down carefully in the journal she kept for her technical notes. Stitch signatures, code patterns, the forensic reading of textile and leather work. She did not know then whether the framework would be useful to anyone beyond herself, but she had her father's conviction that knowledge carefully recorded was never wasted. Hennessy, to his genuine credit, wrote an official report to the Territorial Marshal's office that named Abigail Alden as the principal investigative resource in the Blackridge Syndicate case, and credited her decoding methodology as the critical factor in its resolution. He sent her a copy of the report with a brief personal note that said, in its entirety, "I was wrong in my initial assessment. I am not always wrong." She had folded this note and kept it in the front of her journal. The syndicate case itself played out through the territorial courts over the following year, with Captain Morse's testimony and the stitch-coded evidence she had decoded forming the evidentiary core of the proceedings. The Cheyenne land agent was convicted in the spring of 1879. Several of his associates followed through the summer. The systematic land theft was unwound to the degree that the territorial land records allowed, which was partial but real, and the projected rail corridor was cleared of the corrupted deed claims that would have enriched the syndicate at the public's expense. The supply escort soldiers whose lives had been spared sent a collective letter to Abigail in November, which she received at the sutler's store and read standing at her work table, and which she placed in her journal beside Hennessy's note because she kept the things that mattered. Luke read it when she showed it to him that evening. 4 soldiers who might have been dead by Tuesday, she said. Alive, he said. Because of a saddlebag and a pattern, she said. Because someone looked at the stitching. He put the letter down and looked at her across the work table with the full, direct attention she had come to regard as one of the most significant things she had received from any person. Because you looked at the stitching, he said, the way you look at everything. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp was burning between them and the Wyoming evening was going dark outside the small window and the sage smell was in the air. I have been thinking, she said, about what comes next. He was still. Tell me what you're thinking. I am thinking that I would like to stay in Wyoming, she said. I had not been certain of that until fairly recently. But I have concluded that I am not done with this territory and it is not done with me. She paused. And I am thinking about whether the nature of certain arrangements in my life might change. Formally. The lamplight was very steady in the still air of the room. Luke came around the work table, which was a thing he had not done before, and stood close to her in the way that the last several months had established was entirely welcome. I have been thinking about the same thing, he said, and I have a specific thought about it if you want to hear it. I want to hear it. I want to marry you, he said. He said it without preamble or performance. In the same straightforward way, he said everything that he meant fully. I have been wanting to say that for approximately 3 months, and I have been working out the right moment. And I have concluded that the right moment is any moment where I am in the same room as you, which includes this one. She looked at him. She was aware of the turquoise on the table corner, and the soldier's letter in her journal, and the lamp burning between them, and the particular quality of the evening that felt, in the wordless way certain evenings feel, like a hinge. I want to marry you as well, she said. That is my considered and unequivocal position. He kissed her. It was the first time he had done so, and it was done with the same qualities she had observed in everything he did, with complete attention and without rush, and in a way that communicated, as clearly as the most precisely stitched message, exactly what it was meant to. She returned it in kind. The wedding was held in March of 1879, on a day when the Wyoming winter was making its final arguments with the same ferocity it always brought to that debate, which meant that the ceremony took place inside the garrison chapel, while the wind outside made significant objections. The post-chaplain officiated. Mrs. Haverson wept with generous enthusiasm. Hennessy, who happened to be in the territory on other business, attended and shook Luke's hand with a vigor that communicated wordless things about revised opinions. Several of the soldiers Abigail had mended kit for over the previous year attended and looked, in their cleaned and pressed uniforms, touchingly like men who were making an effort in her honor. Abigail wore a dress she had made herself in the months preceding, ivory wool with a detailed collar that she had worked with a patience and precision that exceeded even her normal standards, because she was the kind of person who brought her full skill to everything that mattered, and this mattered. The stitching at the collar and cuffs was, to anyone who knew how to look, the most beautiful work she had ever done. Luke said when he saw her, approximately nothing, which she interpreted correctly as the most complete form of what he meant. They were married in the presence of Wyoming's magnificent and indifferent weather, and it was entirely perfect. They made their home at the fort initially, in a set of connected rooms that was considerably more spacious than either of them had been inhabiting separately. The room smelled, for a long time, of leather oil and beeswax from Abigail's work, and of the particular outdoor smell of Luke's gear. And she found the combination so completely right that she cataloged it as one of the specific sensory facts of her happiness. Luke's scouting work continued, but he had begun to take longer and more significant contracts that kept him closer to the fort, partly because his reputation had grown after the syndicate case in ways that brought him more substantial work, and partly for reasons she was fully aware of, and which she allowed herself to simply appreciate without requiring him to articulate them. He was a man who demonstrated things through his choices, and she had learned to read his choices with the same attention she brought to thread. In the fall of 1879, she accepted an offer from the Territorial Marshal's office, formalized through Hennessy's recommendation, to serve as a consultant on cases involving forensic analysis of leather and textile work. It was not a full-time appointment and it paid modestly, but it was the first time in her professional life that her specific, unusual expertise had been formally acknowledged by an official body, and the acknowledgement mattered beyond its practical dimensions. She continued her work at the sutler's store, which she had reorganized and expanded since the beginning of the year. She had taken on a young woman apprentice named Clara, 17 years old, who had come to the fort with her widowed father, and who showed a native aptitude for fine needlework that Abigail recognized, and which she had no intention of leaving undeveloped. She taught Clara the way her father had taught her, with rigor, and with respect for what the learning could become. The first winter in their shared rooms was the best Abigail had experienced in Wyoming, which was somewhat counterintuitive given that it was also the coldest. Luke was a good presence in shared space, which was not something she had known she was looking for until she found it. He was naturally quiet, not in the way of a person who had nothing to say, but in the way of a person who had learned to be at ease with silence, and the silences in their rooms were of the same quality as the silences she had first noticed on horseback, comfortable, unhurried, requiring nothing. He read, which she had not known. He had a small collection of books, well worn, that he had carried through years of mobile living with the same care that she had carried her best needles. History, primarily, and accounts of exploration. They read in the evenings by the lamp, sometimes separately and occasionally aloud to each other, and those evenings accumulated into one of the most important textures of her days. He was interested in everything she knew. This did not diminish. He asked her questions about her framework for forensic textile reading with the genuine curiosity of an intelligent person encountering a field of knowledge they respect, and he asked them not once, at the outset, but continuously, as she developed her work and discovered new dimensions of it. He was a natural sounding board because his questions were good. They pushed toward precision rather than broad strokes, toward specifics rather than generalities. In the spring of 1880, she became pregnant, which she identified by its symptoms with characteristic efficiency approximately 2 weeks before she would have been entirely certain, and then set about adjusting her work arrangements accordingly, with the same practical attention she brought to any significant change in operating conditions. Luke, when she told him, sat for a moment in the wooden chair that was still at the work table, transferred now to their shared rooms, with the expression of a man who has received news that has reorganized the entire interior landscape. Then he looked at her with something in his face that was more than she had vocabulary for, which was an unusual state for her. "All right," he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "All right," she agreed. He came to her and held her with a care and a completeness that she allowed entirely and returned in full. Their son was born in November of 1880, which meant Abigail worked through a Wyoming summer while expecting, an experience she described in her journal as clarifying in a number of respects. The labor was managed by the garrison's medical officer and by Mrs. Haverson, who proved unexpectedly capable in a crisis, and by the presence of Luke, who remained in the adjacent room throughout and came in the moment the medical officer gave him leave, and whose face when he saw his son for the first time was one of the most complete things she had ever witnessed. They named him Thomas, for her father. Thomas Townsend was born with dark hair and a clear-eyed watchfulness that his mother recognized. He was a healthy child and a loud one, and the rooms behind the sutler's store adjusted to his presence with some negotiation, and then settled into a new equilibrium that felt, to Abigail's considerable satisfaction, completely right. She was back at her worktable within a month, with Thomas in a cradle she had positioned where she could see him, and where the lamp's light did not disturb him. The work continued. The apprentice Clara continued. The forensic consultation work continued, including a case that winter that involved identifying counterfeit army supply goods through a discrepancy in the stitching specifications, which resulted in the prosecution of a contractor in Denver, and a commendation from the territorial marshal's office that she framed and hung on the wall of the workroom. Luke came back from a 2-week scouting assignment in the spring of 1881 to find Thomas walking, which was not a development he had expected, and which he encountered by almost stepping on his son in the doorway of their rooms. He recovered from this with gratifying speed, crouching down to his son's level and speaking to him with the serious, respectful attention he brought to significant conversations, and Thomas regarded him with the watchful eyes that he had gotten from his mother and reached for his father's nose with both hands. Abigail watched this from the work table and felt something that had no useful word but that she was accustomed to now, the accumulated warmth of the life she had built, which was the life she had not known she was building but which had assembled itself, piece by piece, with the same invisible logic as a well-constructed seam. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1882. They named her Ruth, because Abigail had always liked the book and the woman in it, who had followed where she needed to follow and stayed where she needed to stay with a practical devotion that Abigail found more admirable than the more celebrated kinds of heroism. Ruth Townsend was dark-eyed and immediate in her responses to the world, loudly and specifically communicating her preferences from the earliest possible age, and Luke observed, 2 weeks into her life, that she had her mother's manner. Abigail received this as the compliment it entirely was. The Blackridge Syndicate was officially dissolved by court order in the fall of 1882, following the conclusion of the last of the related prosecutions. The territorial newspaper in Cheyenne ran an account of the case that mentioned, in its 3rd paragraph, the critical role of the forensic decoding work performed by Abigail Alden Townsend, seamstress and leather analysis consultant, whose identification of a hidden stitch code in a recovered saddlebag had provided the pivotal intelligence for the investigation. It was not a full account of what she had done, and it placed her behind several paragraphs about Hennessy and the Army, but it was accurate and it was there, and she read it at her work table with Thomas on her lap pointing at the picture of the horses on the same page and Ruth asleep in her cradle. Luke read it when he came home that evening. He read it twice. Then he looked at her across the room with an expression that carried the full weight of his knowledge of what the account both said and left out and everything that was in between. "You were right about all of it from the beginning," he said, "and you knew you were. Knowing you are right and being taken seriously are not the same thing, she said. I spent a fair amount of my life working with the gap between them. The gap is smaller than it was, he said. It is, she agreed. It is getting smaller. He came and sat beside her, and Thomas immediately transferred his attention to his father, and Luke bore this with the ease of a man who had made his peace with the fact that small children are largely indifferent to conversations they are not the center of. I want to tell you something, Luke said, with Thomas investigating the buttons of his jacket. Tell me. I came to Wyoming without a clear idea of what I was looking for, he said. I don't think I was looking for anything exactly. I was working and moving and not thinking far beyond the next contract. And then I put a dead man's saddlebag on your work table and sat down in that chair. He nodded at the wooden chair, still at the corner of the table where it had always been. And everything I did not know I was looking for was in the room. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas had achieved his goal regarding the buttons and was now working on the code itself. Ruth made a small sound in her cradle that resolved itself back into sleep. The lamp was burning on the table, and the Wyoming evening was coming through the window with the smell of sage and the particular quality of the light at that hour. The stitching, she said, told me where to look. It always does. What did it tell you this time? She looked at him. That the pattern was real, she said. That it had been placed deliberately by someone who knew what they were doing. That it was worth reading carefully. She paused. That it would lead somewhere worth going. He reached across Thomas, who had stopped his investigations and was now simply sitting in his father's lap in the boneless contentment of small children who are exactly where they want to be, and he took her hand. She let him, turning her palm up to meet his with the unhurried certainty of two people who have found each other and know it. Outside, Wyoming was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and impossibly beautiful. The sage and the sky, and the long distances that had been making and remaking people for as long as people had come to them. Inside, the lamp burned steadily and Ruth breathed in her cradle, and Thomas fell asleep against his father's chest, and Abigail Alden Townsend held her husband's hand at the work table where she had once decoded a hidden message and changed 4 soldiers' lives and her own, all in the space of a single piece of careful, painstaking reading. The thread, her father had always said, holds what it connects. Pull it with patience, and the pattern reveals itself, and the pattern is never without meaning if you know how to look. She had always known how to look. Clara became a fine leather worker in her own right, eventually opening a small shop of her own in Laramie when she married in 1884, and Abigail's methodology for forensic textile analysis was incorporated, several years later, into the formal practices of the territorial and then state marshal's office, attributed in the relevant documentation to her by name. The wooden chair remained at the corner of the work table through 2 more moves as the family grew and the rooms expanded around them, because neither she nor Luke had ever proposed moving it, and some arrangements, once they are right, simply stay. Thomas grew up to be a man who read everything he could find and who had his mother's eyes and his father's way of moving through the world, and he became, in the fullness of time, an attorney in Cheyenne who specialized in land and property law, which was a profession that required the patient decoding of complex patterns and which he was, by inheritance and by formation, naturally suited to. Ruth grew up loud and clear-eyed and took no instruction she did not first evaluate for logical soundness, which her mother found entirely reasonable, and which the territory of Wyoming eventually found useful in its own right, because she became a teacher and then a school administrator, and then, in the years when such things became possible, something more than that. And in the spring of 1885, Abigail discovered she was expecting again, the 3rd child, and she told Luke in the evening when the other 2 were in bed and the house was quiet and the lamp was burning, and he looked at her across the familiar table and his expression was the same as it had been the first time and the second time, reorganized, recalibrated, full. "All right," he said in the voice that was never entirely steady for this particular news. "All right," she said. They had been married 6 years, and she had not once regretted the morning. She had put the decoded paper on the table between them. She had not once pretended to be smaller than she was, and he had not once wanted her to be. And the life they had built between them was built on both of those facts in equal measure. The third child, another son, they named James, for no one in particular and for the Wyoming territory in general, because it seemed like a name that fit the place, and the place had given them everything. Fort Laramie grew and changed around them as the years passed. The railroad reached Laramie and then pushed further west, and the territory filled in around the tracks with the speed that always attended that kind of infrastructure. Ranches and farms and small towns, and the whole complicated human negotiation, with a landscape that was not built for easy habitation, but that rewarded the honest and persistent effort to understand it. The injustices of that filling in were real, and Abigail wrote about them in her journal and spoke about them when speaking seemed likely to matter, because she was not a person who looked away from things that did not resolve comfortably. But she was also, and fully, a person who had made a life of genuine substance in a place she had chosen, and with a person she had chosen, and who understood that these things were not in contradiction, that you could hold the complicated truth of a place and love the specific good things that the place had given you, and that both the complication and the love were honest. Luke retired from active scouting in 1887, when James was 2, and took a position with the Territorial Surveyor's Office that used his field knowledge and his map reading, and kept him home with a regularity that he did not announce a preference for, and which Abigail observed and kept to herself, as one of the things she knew about him that she particularly valued. He surveyed land in the mornings and read in the evenings and fixed things around the house with the practical competence of a man who was comfortable with physical work. And on Sunday afternoons, he took Thomas and Ruth and James on walks into the surrounding country and taught them what he knew about reading a landscape. Abigail sometimes went with them on these walks and sometimes did not, because she was still working and the Sunday afternoons were among her most productive hours. But on the walks she did take, she went with the same attention she brought everywhere, looking at the country around her, and finding in it the patterns that the country was always laying down for anyone with patience enough to read them. The dead man in the gulch had never been identified, which was a fact she carried with her quietly over the years as one of the unclosed threads of the case. In 1889, the year Wyoming achieved statehood, Hennessy sent her a letter. He was retiring from the Marshal's service and had done a final review of the Blackridge Syndicate case files, and he had found, in the records of a Denver County office, a death registration that matched the physical description of the man Luke had found in that dry gulch 11 years earlier. His name had been Aaron Milhaven. He had been a former Army telegrapher who had stumbled onto the syndicate's operations in the course of his civilian work and had been building a case against them. He had sewn his evidence into a saddlebag because he had understood, correctly, that it was the kind of evidence that needed to be hidden in plain sight, in a language that most people did not know to read. He had trusted that someone would eventually look at the right thing with the right eyes. Abigail read Hennessy's letter at her work table on a September morning, when the light coming through her window was the particular clear gold of Wyoming in early fall, and she sat for a time with the letter in her hands thinking about Aaron Milhaven, who had made his evidence readable for whoever came next, who had trusted the pattern to communicate across whatever gap of time or chance would have to be crossed before the right reader arrived. She told Luke about it that evening. He read the letter and put it down and was quiet for a long moment. He chose the right language, Luke said finally. He chose the only language he was confident could not be ignored by the right person, she said. He knew someone with eyes for it would come eventually. He was right. He was. She took the letter and added it to the small collection of significant documents she kept in her journal: Hennessy's original note, the soldier's letter, the newspaper account, and now this. The record of what a hidden pattern had done, and what finding it had cost, and what it had given. She looked across the table at Luke, who was looking at her in the way he always did, with the complete and specific attention that had first reorganized her interior assessment of him on a morning 11 years ago, and which had never become ordinary or backgrounded. He was gray now at the temples, and the lines at the corners of his eyes were settled in, and he was the most familiar thing in her world, and she looked at him with the same quality of attention that he brought to her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking about thread," she said, which was not even slightly strange between them. "About how the right stitch in the right place holds everything together, about how the pattern only becomes visible from a certain angle with a certain quality of attention." "The angle you have always had," he said. "The angle you had too," she said. "From the beginning. You brought me the bag because something in you already knew it was worth looking at carefully. You were not reading stitching, but you were reading something." He was quiet. "I suppose I was," he said. "So," she said, "the pattern had two readers. It was always going to find us both." Outside the window, Wyoming was going from gold to the long purple of its evenings, and the children were in the house behind them, Thomas reading and Ruth conducting some project or other with her characteristic focused energy, and James asleep already, as he always was by this hour, with the absolute conviction of a 7-year-old for whom sleep is a natural and unconflicted state. The house was full of the particular warmth of inhabited space, of people who are home. Abigail picked up her needle. Luke opened his book. The lamp burned steadily between them. The thread held what it connected. The pattern had always been there for anyone willing to look with real eyes, and she had looked, and what she had found had been, from the first morning to this one, exactly and completely worth finding.